Hello everyone, welcome to another interview. Today I am with Brian. Brian, feel free to introduce yourself.
My name is Rabbi Brian Michelson. I am the rabbi of Reform Congregation Oheb Shalom in Reading, Pennsylvania. Technically we're in Wyomissing in the western suburbs, but most people don't know where Wyomissing is. It's Reading.
Fair enough. When I looked up this place, first I saw Reading, and then I was like, oh wait, actually the address is Wyomissing, and I was like, all right. But thank you for having us here. Super appreciative for this opportunity. And I'm going to start off this interview with a very simple question. What is Judaism?
Very simple question. Now give me an hour to answer it. The short answer is that Judaism is the oldest of the three Abrahamic faiths. It is the earliest of the monotheistic, the belief in one God. And we trace our origins all the way back to Abraham making the covenant with God, all the way back in the story of Genesis as we read in the Hebrew Bible. And the idea is that we as Jews believe that we live in covenant, in relationship with God, that was made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, again with Moses and the people of Israel during the Exodus from Egypt. We have been given laws to live by. We call those commandments. And the commandments talk about the things that we are to do and the things we're not to do. And Judaism has existed and kind of survived through all sorts of historical moments in time. Hasn't always been easy to be a Jew. It's still not to some extent. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we are still here to talk about it. So the idea is that we believe that we live by doing what God has asked us to do, by living out the commandments, we brings us closer to that relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. And by what I understand also about Judaism, as far as how Jews may approach the Old Testament or approach the law, as you have mentioned in your description, can sometimes differ depending maybe what background or tradition they're from. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe outline a little bit for us what are the different maybe sects of Judaism, the most popular ones, mm-hmm. and kind of what differentiates them?
There are probably four main streams of Judaism. We tend to use the word stream as opposed mm-hmm. to sect because we all recognize each other as Jews. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily agree on our theology, but we all are celebrating the same holidays and the same festivals, and most of the values are exactly the same. The debate comes on some of the, finer points or origin stories of things things like that. So we'd start with the oldest. The oldest, which was all that existed up until about 200 years ago, is what we refer today as Orthodox Judaism.
Okay.
Orthodox Judaism, traditional Judaism, teaches that the 5 books of Moses that we have today were given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai, word for word, and the text that we have today is exactly the same text that Moses was given up on the mountain. And therefore, the text is, because it is divine, is perfect and automatically correct, and that anything that is incorrect or seems contradictory in the text has to do with our inability to understand it, as opposed to the fact that the text itself might be inconsistent. And they tend to be the most traditional in terms of practice and style. One of the groups people see most frequently, like on television or in the movies, are what we refer to as the ultra-Orthodox, which is the side curls, the fancy hats.
Would the Hasidic fall under that category?
Yes, the Hasidic are part of that group. But there are multiple groups that fall into this ultra-Orthodox category. Okay. But they're going to see the world relatively similar to the mainstream Orthodox Jews, just their practice is going to be a little stricter. Okay. In terms of they will follow the determinations of their rabbi as opposed to a more broad spectrum of people. There is the second group that was started was the Reform movement, which is where I come from, which is a liberal movement of Judaism, and it comes out of post-Enlightenment Germany. It was about trying to answer the question of how could one be German or a citizen of the world and a Jew at the same time, especially since post-Enlightenment, Jews gained opportunities that they had never had previously. So, for example, all of a sudden Jews were now allowed to be voting citizens. They could attend university. They could hold certain jobs that were never available to us as a community before. And so that started to break down the walls of the ghetto. And so people tried to figure out, well, how can I live in both worlds at once? And so the Reform movement came out as a more liberal movement and is trying to understand how does God want us to live? But with the big difference would be the origin of the biblical material. So I would say we believe that something happened at Mount Sinai, that there was a revelation. What I would then say is then it gets passed down through human hands, and nobody with any ill will, but to serve their needs, to make sense in their time, the text gets tweaked. The same thing that happens when you play, a game of telephone, right? Yes, there's always usually one person who does it just to mess it up. But if you assume that there's goodwill on most people's part, they had certain things that were important to them that they wanted to stress, and that we're playing or interested in not only what does the letter of the law say, but what does the spirit of the law say. And that, sometimes there is a debate which becomes more important, the letter or the spirit. And so the Reform movement also broke down some of the barriers in terms of equality. In Orthodox synagogues, men and women sit separately. In Reform synagogues, families will sit together, men and women will sit together. Orthodox congregations will not have female rabbis or female cantors, whereas the Reform movement has been training and ordaining females for over 45, 50 years.
Okay.
And so because our understanding of where the texts come from and how the world changes is somewhat different. Coming out as a kind of an outgrowth of the early Reform movement came the conservative movement, a uniquely American movement that tries to maintain that balance between the tradition of orthodoxy and the reform of the reformers. It is a movement that says it still accepts Torah from Sinai, but tends to be able to create arguments that will allow it to become more modern at the same time. There too, there tend to be egalitarian congregations, but however, not all. In fact, we actually share our building. We have a congregation that rents space from us that is a conservative congregation. Our bigger service is going to be a Friday evening. Their bigger service is Saturday morning, so we can share the space together. And for the most part, we don't step on each other's toes. And we can do a number of things together because we all recognize the fact that we're celebrating some of the same things. There is a fourth movement in Judaism called Reconstructionism. Reconstructionism is a more modern movement, comes out of this is a test of my memory, I think it's the 1930s and early 40s, is a movement that was based on the teachings of a man by the name of Mordechai Kaplan. Kaplan was an incredible theologian who argued that Judaism doesn't exist because we have a relationship with God. Judaism exists because there are ways that Jews do certain things. And we don't do them because they are commanded, like we would say, out of the relationship. He says we do them because they're the Jewish things to do. He doesn't say that God doesn't exist. His thought is more that God may exist, may or may not exist, but we don't necessarily have any relationship with that God. And therefore, why do we do things? We do things because it's the Jewish way of doing them. That's actually a movement that was founded relatively close to here. Their headquarters are just outside of Philadelphia.
Oh, interesting.
And so you have, those are the four major. There are a couple of other smaller groups that exist as well, but those would be the four main streams of Judaism.
Okay, yeah, I think that helps clarify some of the differences, especially for people who aren't familiar with Judaism at all. Now, I would just be kind of curious, did you grow up within the Reform community, or was this something you came to? How did you get introduced to?
I was raised in what I consider a traditional Reform home. We knew that Friday night that we would be home for dinner, and that services Friday night were a probability most weeks. That we celebrated the holidays, and the expectation is you would be home to be able to celebrate the holidays and attend synagogue on all the various holiday days. So I did grow up in the movement. I did spend some time debating before I actually entered the rabbinate.
Okay.
I spent some time debating whether I was going to be a Reform or a conservative rabbi, and I ended up as choosing the Reform seminary instead of the conservative, more for some theological issues that just made sense to me. I have a great deal of respect for my colleagues from the conservative seminary, and think they're well trained. It's just it's a slightly different kind of training, and it's a slightly different kind of way of looking at the world. And I thought, for me, this was the best place for me to do this, because it's closest to the ideals and the values that I hold dear.
And by what I understand, Judaism, unlike, let's say, take for instance, like Christianity or Islam, which tend to be a little bit more evangelical, they try to proselytize people and convert people. By what I understand, Judaism isn't quite like that. Normally, they don't try to convert people. Is this something you're sort of born into, or is there a process of like philosophical ascent or something like that?
No, Judaism is an interesting. We fall into kind of a weird category, because Judaism is something you can be born into, and you can be born as a Jew, and traditionally that would say you are born of a Jewish mother. You never have to do any practice any day in your life, but you are still considered Jewish all throughout your life. It's not like most of the churches where you have to make a statement of faith in order to be able to join the church. We exist both to some extent as a people, but also as a religion. And part of that is our minority status, and because we're so small, and part of it is just the way Judaism has been inherited. Gives it this kind of little bit of tension between those two ideals. So yes, you can be born into Judaism, and there are people who do convert to Judaism, but the process of conversion to Judaism is a rather long and complicated process for a number of different reasons. One of the things that people often misunderstand is that up until around the year 300 CE, and do you understand if I use CE as opposed to AD? Okay. Yeah. Just the reason I don't is because AD is a faith statement.
Yeah.
That's not part of my faith.
Yeah.
So I tend to use the academic terminology, BCE and CE.
Yep.
So around in 300 CE, up until that time, Judaism actually, to some extent, sought out converts or welcomed them in a little bit more freely. One of the things that happened was the Council of Nicaea, the church held in 323, I believe it was. One of the things that was passed there was it prohibited intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and it also said that conversion to Judaism was illegal, right? And the punishment for being caught converting was death. So it didn't stop the process of conversion, but it, in a sense, pushed it underground. So as opposed to saying we're evangelical, we're reaching out, we're trying to get people in, Judaism has always been a little bit more of the, are you sure that this is right for you? We want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. Before the idea, I guess what I would put it is, we want to make sure you have most of the knowledge you need before you convert, And then we'll talk about conversion as opposed to convert first, get the information later.
Yeah.
The other part of it is also a little bit of, I guess, Jewish wonderment, is the concept of to be a Jew has never been easy. You can go through almost any period of history and find times where the Jews have been persecuted by one group or another.
Yep.
And so the question that people sometimes ask people who are interested in conversion is like, you want to become one of us, right? You want somebody to dislike you just because of your religious background, without knowing you. You want to, join this little minority group that is despised by so many voluntarily. I don't have a choice. I do have a choice, but we were born into it.
Yeah.
But the idea that you would voluntarily choose this is, something that not looked at it as askance, but it is, shall we say, part of the questioning that goes into the process of dealing with people who are interested in conversion.
Interesting. So let's just take that position then that someone now, whether born or converting, is interested in living out a Jewish lifestyle. You mentioned some key things that need to be celebrated or key principles that need to be followed that are shared among even the different streams of Judaism. Could you explain what some of those fundamental principles are, maybe those holidays or what they are, that if someone wants to practice Judaism, what does that look like?
Right. Well, the thing about Judaism that I always try to make clear is the fact that Judaism is not just a religious faith. It really is meant to be a way of life. So the commandments and the practices of Judaism can enter into everything that you do in your life if you let it do so. People do so to varying degrees, and that's fine. People make their own choices as to what's meaningful to them and the like, but but it can impact almost everything.
Yeah.
When we talk about the major things that we do as a community, we all celebrate the Sabbath. We say the Shabbat is the Hebrew for it.
Yeah.
The seventh day is the day that God set aside, that God rested, and that we are commanded to rest as God rested. So actually the Sabbath, even though it occurs 52 times a year, is considered the most important of the holidays we celebrate because it is the one that we know that God celebrates, because it talks about, and God rested on that day, right? And so it is this, we live in imitation of God. Then there's the whole cycle of holidays that we celebrate throughout the year. These holidays are all legislated for us, and God says you're going to celebrate these following holidays. And they start in the fall with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And we celebrate the beginning of the new Jewish year. Now, if you were to count back, we are currently in the year 5783. And if you take the text literally, if you count back 5,783 years ago, where 24 hours is 24 hours, that supposedly is when creation occurred, right? Whether that's true or not, we can debate at another time, and different streams of Judaism will understand whether that's exactly true or not differently.
Yes.
But the idea is we celebrate the beginning of the new Jewish year. That's quickly followed up by the fact that we celebrate the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, a day of fasting where we ask for forgiveness from our sins.
Isn't that soon coming up?
We're about 6 weeks from Rosh Hashanah, about 8 weeks from Yom Kippur.
I see it on the calendar. That's why.
Yeah, one of the things that people often don't understand is that the Jewish calendar. It's interesting. As Jews, we live on two calendars.
Okay.
Right. I live on the Jewish calendar, and I live on the secular calendar. Right. So I do believe that the year is 2023. Right. But at the same time, it's also 5783. Right. Because if I were to write 5783 on my checks, the bank wouldn't cash them. The idea being is that the Jewish calendar is, for the most part, a lunar calendar. And it goes from the new moon each month to the 15th day of the month is the full moon, and then the moon wanes and goes back to the new moon, and then you have a new month.
Yeah.
Islam maintains a very similar calendar.
Islam does the same thing for Ramadan.
The difference is Islam maintains a strict lunar calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And if you compare the lunar calendar to the solar calendar, the lunar calendar is 11 days shorter.
Mm.
Now, some of the festivals that we celebrate are harvest festivals. So we don't want to be celebrating the wheat harvest at the wrong time, right? That would kind of be silly. So there's a series of leap years that go in where about every 3 years or so, there's an extra month added in, because if you lose 33 days, 11 days a year for 3 years, you add the month back in, you've added back 28, 29 days in. So there's a whole mathematical formula for this. 9 times out of every 17 years, there's a leap year, and that keeps our holidays celebrated around the right time.
Mm.
It doesn't change the date on the Hebrew calendar, but it does mean that in relationship to the secular calendar, we may have had the holiday last year on September 5th, and this year it's going to be on September 15th, right?
Yeah.
So people often go, well, hold it, I know what day. Easter's going to always be this day on Sunday. Well, but it's always the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei for Rosh Hashanah, but that's going to vary based on the secular calendar.
Okay.
And Jews usually talk about whether the holidays are early or late. They never seem to be on time. But that's just one of the things that we have the chance to talk about. So we talked about the harvest festivals. There are 3 of them: Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, and finally Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, which is the wheat harvest. So it's end of summer harvest, barley harvest, wheat harvest. Mm-hmm. Along with that, there are a number of other holidays that have been added in. We celebrate Hanukkah, which is the holiday most people have heard of, although is supposed to be a minor holiday by Jewish standards. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We also have the Festival of Esther, which celebrates what happens in the Book of Esther, and is a day of celebration and silliness, shall we say, as well as some more modern holidays that have been added to the calendar as well.
What do you mean silliness? I'm curious. You piqued my interest.
Oh, the story is that we are to celebrate on Purim, and so there is a tradition that you can get away with things on Purim that you can't get away with all the rest of the year. So there's a tradition, we do what's called a Purim spiel here, which is a musical setting of some sort. I'm trying to remember what they're doing this year, but it tells the story of Esther with songs and in funny ways, but also will poke fun at people. They'll make jokes at my expense during the middle of it. They might make comments on political situations that are going on in the world, and things that would be considered outside the norm of acceptable most of the year are allowed. There's even a tradition that says that on Purim you're allowed to drink, where you don't know, to the point where you don't know the difference between the hero and the villain. And so in Israel, they have their big signs up that time of year saying, don't drink and drive. Because people are celebrating. And so it is this idea of being joyful. It's to some extent, I kind of look at it and say it's the steam valve of Judaism, where it says on many days, most days we can be serious, but at the same time, we have one time a year where you're allowed and encouraged to get silly.
Okay, interesting. And then beyond those holodays, does that summarize most of it, or?
Well, then you're going to have some more of the modern holidays, which are going to be things like Holocaust Remembrance Day, Memorial Day, and Israeli Independence Day, which some communities observe and other communities don't.
Okay. And in regard to, I think this is a good transition to trying to understand modern day Judaism's relationship with Old Testament law and practice when it comes to, let's say the Torah or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or that's coming from a Christian perspective when I say Old Testament, but
that's okay.
Either way, but when it comes to the Torah, how does one, I guess that depends on each stream. How does one interpret or approach the Old Testament? I know you kind of talked about whether or not to take it literally or not, but if I understand, Reform would still follow certain parts of the Old Testament.
Yes.
So how's that look?
Part of it is also we as Jews don't tend to be literalists in terms of Torah, and this doesn't matter which stream you're talking about. Just because Torah says that this is what you do, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way Judaism is practiced today.
Okay.
It's always seen through the prism of Jewish interpretation. And one of the interesting things about Judaism is Judaism is not a monolith. So I can give you an idea of what people believe, but everyone's belief is going to be a little bit different. And we're told in Judaism that we are measured by the people we are, the things that we do. It's not by the beliefs that we claim to, it's put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. And so there are very few things in Judaism that are tied to necessarily belief. There are very few thought crimes or thought sins within Judaism. The idea is sometimes you may have thoughts that are not the best. The question is more, what do you do with those thoughts, right? How do you manage them? And if you don't carry them out, you don't do something bad, then that's considered good. So we always look at it through this prism of Jewish interpretation, and there are multiple interpretations in terms of how do we understand most of these things, the minuscule and sometimes the ridiculous. Sometimes there are major differences in terms of how we understand what does it mean to do X, Y, or Z.
Because I guess in my mind, sometimes the confusion can arise where it's like, all right, you see within a passage where it talks about food laws, which is a very common thing within like Leviticus and so forth. And it expounds upon food laws, or maybe it expounds upon attire in certain areas. And then and observing different streams, and they kind of interpret how they follow those laws to a certain extent their own way. I guess my question is there this understanding of an objective morality then that a Jew needs to follow, or is it more of...
There are some underlying things that I think all Jews would agree that are values that Judaism holds. The idea of one God, the idea that we live in relationship, and the idea that we have an obligation to try and do the right thing, both in our lives but also in the world. That for almost any holiday, when it talks about celebrating tzedakah, charity, the giving of tithes and the like, is always a part of it. The idea that we must always take care of the weak and the vulnerable in our communities. We can see, what does that mean? It says to take care of the widow and the orphan. Right. To leave for them the corners of the field. Well, I don't have a field to leave them the corners of. So the question is, how do I understand it? Well, I understand that I have the obligation to give money. Right? Because that's what I earn. I am leaving the gleanings of the corner of my field by sharing what I have been able to gather with others. So
in a sense, taking an agricultural society and now translating it into a more urban society.
Correct. Right? How do you make that happen? Some of it is also a difference as to, you talked about the dietary laws. So I eat and follow according to the dietary laws. My home, we keep a strictly kosher home traditionally. The separation of meat and milk, separate dishes, pots, pans, no pork, no shellfish. The meat that we eat is always kosher, and has been slaughtered in a particular way and treated in a particular way. Now, if you ask me, the question though is, I don't believe God actually cares whether I eat a cheeseburger or not. Right? My more traditional counterparts may say, yes, God does. I don't believe that the dietary laws are necessarily about whether I eat a cheeseburger. I think it has more to do with, for me, it is an act of gratitude. Right? It takes the mundane act of eating and makes it a Jewish act. It makes it holy, because I have to think about the fact that if I want ice cream for dessert, I got to think about what I'm having for dinner, or and so therefore the idea is to be able to put a little bit of focus on what you're doing, so it doesn't just happen.
And I know talking to a Muslim before, they made a similar comment, because Muslims aren't allowed to eat certain things as well, like
Correct.
pork. And he made a comment along the lines of, it's more of the idea that even if we don't fully understand why God may want us to do something, we do it anyway because he's God. That was also his sort of line of reasoning for food laws in their religion.
And some of the Orthodox would make that the same argument there. And the fact of the matter is, in my heart of hearts, do I believe that this is actually what the Torah intended when it said, do not cook a calf in its own mother's milk, do not boil a calf in its own mother's milk? Theologically, probably not. But I can understand that intellectually, but from a practical point of view, it doesn't change what I do.
Yeah.
And my comment to other people is, because there are plenty of Jews who don't follow the dietary laws, is if they work for you in terms of being meaningful, then follow them. If they give meaning to your life, great. If not, I don't think we were meant to be weighed down with meaningless tasks, because the honest answer is there are commandments we don't fulfill, right? That we talked about the leaving the corners of your field. How many of us would have survived to adulthood if our parents, who have the right to take out rebellious children and have them stoned at the city gate for talking back to them, most of us would probably not be around, right? The Torah talks, where the punishment in Torah is considered, for most things, is death.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Capital punishment. Yet Judaism, for the most part, takes a very dim view of capital punishment. It doesn't say the Torah is wrong, but it says that in our circumstances today, we choose to read the material slightly differently and say, if a court gives a death sentence once every 50 years, it's considered a hanging court. The idea is we're not rushing out to do it.
Yeah.
And so if we're saying, well, it's about looking honestly at all of this, not saying I'm just going to keep this, this, and this. It's like I have to look at and know and understand the text to understand where I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's a whole interesting concept, because I've also, in regard to death penalty, I've talked to people before who have said that within the Torah and stuff, a lot of the penalties prescribed to the laws are actually the maximums. They weren't understood necessarily to be the what you do every single time. They were understood to be the maximum punishments allowed in regard to the eye for an eye justice system. But yeah, that's an interesting concept, interesting way of approaching Torah, approaching the law.
Right.
And now, we've been speaking a lot about Torah, but there's other books that come into Jewish thought. What would be some of the most influential books within Judaism that help shape the way they approach their theology?
There are a number of different major texts that exist. Probably one of the possibly better known and most important ones, something called the Babylonian Talmud. I use the term Babylonian specifically to indicate where it comes from, because actually there are two different Talmuds that exist. There was one that was there was one that was written in Palestine, because that's what it was called by the Romans at that time, and then there was the Babylonian one, which came about 100 years later. The Babylonian one is considered far more authoritative and is a text that is both texts are still studied. But if you want to know what the text says, the first place when you talk about Talmud, you're going to go to the Babylonian Talmud.
Okay.
And it is a collection of debates and conversations between the rabbis about various topics. Now, it's presented as if some of these people were actually having the conversation together. Problem is sometimes in the arguments that we have people who are 100 years apart from each other, and so they never actually had the conversation. But we know that their school taught this particular thing, or that this school believed this, and that they will put it as if they were having that conversation. And it's a debate about how do we understand what the laws mean. One of the best ways to give an example of this is the Torah tells us that 6 days you shall labor, on the seventh day you shall do no work.
Yeah.
Right? That's about the extent of what the Shabbat commandment is in Torah. Right? We know the one thing that you're not supposed to do is gather wood, because there's the story of the wood gatherer who gets stoned.
Yep.
Right? But other than that, it doesn't necessarily define what does work on Shabbat actually entail. Right? So the Talmud is that debate of, well, is this in keeping with Shabbat? Is this not in keeping with Shabbat? What are the things that override Shabbat, even though you would theoretically say they shouldn't be done because they're work, because there are other issues. The thing that I'm thinking about is, for example, is if you're thinking about an agricultural society, about, okay, you have cattle, you're milking cows, right? Torah and the Talmud actually tell us, Talmud more so says, you're supposed to milk your cows on Shabbat, because if you don't, you're putting the animal in harm's way, right? You're putting the animal into pain. So even though we would look at it and say, that seems like work, the overriding concept of not harming something else overrides that. And that there are things that we do and we don't do, and how do you decide exactly what that is?
Yeah.
And the honest answer is that conversation is still going on today, right? Because the question is, the rabbis 1,500 years ago had no concept of the world in which we live.
Yeah.
So how do we then understand, using some of their argumentation and their theories and their values, to understand what does it mean for us today? There's going to be differences of opinion, but these are documents that are still alive in that sense. The other text that is really important is something called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is an 18th century text that was tried to put together all of the laws of, here are the laws you actually need to live as a Jew on a day-to-day basis. Right? And they tried to put it all together and said, okay, you do it this way, and this way. If you're lighting the Hanukkah candles, okay, we put the candles in from left to right, but we light them from right to left. Right? It's kind of the handbook. But even there are, because it was written by the rabbi of a single community, there's all of this commentary on top of it that says, well, our community does it this way, or our community, we do it that way, but that is still, for one of the more authoritative texts.
And outside of the Torah itself, the first 5 books, are the other books of like the Hebrew Bible, or from a Christian perspective, what we may call the Old Testament, would those also be included often within the Jewish canon?
Oh, absolutely. They're part of what we would refer to as the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, which is, the difference is, the books that are contained in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are the same. The ordering of the books is different.
Okay.
The Hebrew Bible...
And for clarity's sake, Catholic Old Canon and Protestant Old Testament canon are going to look a little bit different. Would Maccabees, for instance, be included in the Tanakh? Oh, I said that wrong.
That's
Tanakh.
Okay. No.
Okay.
Maccabees is too late to have been included.
Okay.
What is believed to be, and I'll talk from my own perspective.
Yeah, feel free.
From my personal point of view, the youngest book in the Hebrew Bible is probably the book of Daniel.
Okay.
The reason I say that is because parts of Daniel are written in another language. They're written in the language that's called Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew, but not actually Hebrew.
Yeah.
It's written in Hebrew letters, and it was a language that was used by the Jews to communicate amongst the community, regardless of what other language you spoke, for about 700 years. It was the language that Jesus spoke, right? Because that would have been the language of the language of the land for most business that was carried on in the Jewish community. And so the fact that the Aramaic exists in Daniel gives us that hint that it's probably a later edition.
Okay.
So Daniel's the last book. That would be sometime, I would think, about 165 BCE. Maccabees didn't happen until, around that time.
Yeah.
And so the books were not included. So when I say the Old Testament, I would include the Deuterocanonicals are not part of our. They're really interesting, but they're not part of our sacred texts at all. Especially since if you read Maccabees, for example, the first two are all about the story of the Maccabees. 3 and 4, they're kind of weird. No other way to say it.
Yeah.
But the difference has to do with, if you look at the way the Hebrew Bible is set up, it's kind of a different understanding of the relationship with God, right? So Torah starts off with, Torah is the idea of the revealed text of God, right? God revealed it to Moses. When we get to the prophets, God still speaks to the prophets, but he doesn't speak to them like he spoke to Moses.
Okay.
Right? There's not this, I'm coming down in a cloud and I'm going to speak to you and I'm going to tell you what to do and what to say and all of these kinds of things. How does God manifest in the prophets? It's usually through visions, right? Which is one step a little bit more removed, right? And so it's, I am bringing to you God's word, but in a somewhat more removed way.
Yeah.
If we get to the third section, which is what we call the books of the writings, which is Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Esther, Ruth, First and Second Chronicles,
Job. Okay.
Job, Daniel, all of these kind of later books.
Yeah.
There's no debate here as to who are the authors of these books. Or I shouldn't say that. We debate who wrote them. For example, people say King David wrote most of the Psalms. Okay. I would probably argue that from an academic point of view, but I do believe that David was probably involved with some of them.
Yeah.
But there's no argument that they were written by they were of human origin, right? Whether you say David wrote all 150 of them or not, right? Somebody who is flesh and blood wrote them. And all of the books in the last section are trying to answer the question of how do we live in relationship with God? How do we live in a world where things don't always make the sense that that is promised to us a little bit earlier on, where everything is said, you do good things, you're going to get rewarded, you do bad things, you're going to be punished. Right? I would argue that a good section of the book of Job is all about the question of evil and the question of saying, evil just happens, right? And that it is not necessarily God's plan, but it's there.
He allows it to occur. I mean, Job is a very interesting book. The way it even starts off with this perfect man, basically, not maybe quite perfect, but basically perfect Job, and then the devil talks to God, and he's like, you know what? He's going to deny. It's just a very fascinating book to me.
Right. And it's also fascinating if you think there is some good theological studies that have been done that actually argue that the beginning and the end were actually added onto the book of Job to kind of redeem the book of Job, to put God back in the book in some ways. But yeah, it's a very uncomfortable, tough book to read because the idea of how do you explain suffering? How do you explain bad things happening to good people? And it's saying they were struggling with those. We struggle with these same questions today, and that's for me part of how the text continues to live.
The way you're describing Judaism to me kind of makes sense with to a certain extent. I don't want to say necessarily my preconceptions, but my understanding of Judaism to a certain extent, because even within the term of Israel, wrestling with God. That's sort of what I'm getting the gist of with how you're kind of describing, where there's this constant debate, this constant trying to learn more about how do we live in this world and maintain a relationship with God. How does this all look, and constantly trying to learn and do that. And as you said, this seems to be a continual process. Rabbis are still debating and still trying to figure out theology and figure out life in general.
Right, because the world changes, and there is an old Jewish tradition that says you ask 3 Jews, you're going to get 4 opinions.
I've heard that, yeah.
Right? But that's also because Judaism, we come from a tradition that says it's okay to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say, here's what you must believe, check off the boxes. It's, you know, we're all negotiating with the text.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I will do a weekly Torah study, and we'll sit down and read some of the portion, and somebody will say something, and I'll go, I never even thought of that before, right? Or somebody will say, well, what do they traditionally make of it? And so I'll look it up and come up with, you know, what was the more traditional answer of what did they deal? But there are, you know, I have 18 or 19 commentaries I can read on the 5 books of Moses. That all offer their own perspective, and that's because Judaism says it's okay for us to struggle. That's part of what being Yisrael, wrestling with God, is all about. It's about not always having the answer, or not always being clear, and being okay with that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. I've been really enjoying this. I think we're about approaching an hour, so we're going to be wrapping this up. But one quick question before we do. Something that I personally never quite understood, a practice that I didn't know, because I'm pretty well versed with Scripture, pretty familiar with a lot of the Old Testament stuff. But one thing I couldn't ever quite figure out is, why do some Jewish men choose to wear the kippah or the yarmulke? What's that serve?
The kippah or the yarmulke is actually a very late introduction into Judaism. When I say late, the last 500 years. When you're a 4,000-year-old religion, you can call last 500 years late. There is no requirement of covering one's head that comes from Torah. The best thinking is that it actually comes out of the ghettos of Venice. In 1511 was the first time that Jews were ghettoized in Venice. They were forced to live on a particular set of islands, and the gates were locked at night. If a Jewish man went outside the ghetto, he had to wear something called the Jew hat. And there is some evidence to argue that we took what was supposed to be a form of shame and turned it into a worship of God. The idea is that it is a reminder that God is always above us.
Okay.
That we are always, you know, that there is always something greater than we are. Some people will wear it all the time. Some people wear it only during prayers, and some Jews will not wear it at all. And you'll see tonight that some people will have it on and others won't.
Okay.
And that's just a matter of more traditional congregations where you would see everybody all the men wearing it. In our community, being egalitarian, you may even see some women wearing it.
Okay, I was about to ask, like, oh, is it just men then, or?
Traditionally, it was just the men. Women kept their hair covered in different ways, and that's a whole different conversation. But the yarmulke or the kippah was specifically male.
Okay, all right, interesting. Any final thoughts or anything you would like to say before we would close this that you want to close out with?
The only thing that I always think is important to mention is the idea that I always encourage people to make sure to check out their information. There's a lot of misinformation out there on Judaism and Jews, and a lot of prejudice about the Jewish community, and the fact of the matter is, we are people who are trying to worship and live the right kind of life.
Yeah.
The same way as anybody else is trying to. We don't have to believe that we have the only way. This is our way.
Yeah.
We're not saying it's the only way. All we ever ask from anybody else is, you can have your different way, and please go forth, live it, do it, and if it makes you a better person, that's fantastic. All we ever ask for is the respect to be able to do the same thing ourselves and to live our way.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming on here and explaining Judaism. And this was a great talk. I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. Very engaged. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, friends, go out there and light the world yourselves.